Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. The Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network, the Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, and Outlaw for tonight's panel, Gender Expression and Client Service in the Courtroom. The Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network at NYU School of Law works to remedy gender inequities in the legal profession through innovative leadership training and conversations like these. In our January book talk with Alicia Menendez, which you can find on our website if you weren't there for it, she raised the idea that young professionals today face a tension between old rules for success and new, more inclusive rules that aren't yet fully formed, but promise to benefit leaders of all genders. As part of our effort to explore this tension between old and new rules for how gender expression relates to professionalism in the legal field, we're thrilled to bring you tonight's panel, where we'll delve into this tension and how it affects not just our careers, but our clients' cases. We are so grateful to our moderator and panelists for joining us tonight. Before I turn it over for introductions, a few logistics. First, this event has been approved for 1 New York State CLE credit for experienced attorneys only in the category of diversity, inclusion, and elimination of bias. Though of course we welcome all newly admitted attorneys, law students, and non-attorneys who are with us tonight. For those seeking CLE credit, please record all CLE attendance verification codes that are announced throughout the program. And following the program, attendees will receive an email link to an attorney affirmation and evaluation form. To earn credit, attendees seeking CLE will need to fill out the form and enter all CLE codes that are announced during the program. We will have time for questions at the end, so please submit questions throughout the program via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can. Now I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator, Professor Madeline Wasilczyk. She directs and teaches the LSU Juvenile Defense Clinic, where she and her students represent children in East Baton Rouge Parish. Prior to joining LSU, she began her career at the Defender Association of Philadelphia. She holds a BA in International Affairs with honors summa cum laude from American University and is a proud alumna of NYU Law. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to her to get us started.
Thanks so much, Abby. So I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves. I'd like to turn it over first to Gabriel Arkless.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Gabriel Arkless, and I am Senior Counsel at the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. I graduated from NYU in '04, and I worked for around 6 years, primarily doing direct legal services, civil legal services. Then I was teaching skills in law schools for 7 years. And then for the last, 4 years or so, I've been doing impact litigation.
Thank you so much. Now I'd like to turn it over to Danny Green.
Sorry, brief technical difficulties. My name is Danny Green. I am a recent grad from NYU Law. I graduated in 2018. Since that time, I've been at the Bronx Defenders in a dual role, working in the criminal defense practice and also in the LGBTQ defense practice. So in the criminal defense practice, I represent clients in criminal cases, and then in the LGBTQ defense practice, I do cross-practice work, so family, criminal, immigration, and civil. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Last and not least, I'd like to introduce or have Lisa Hoyes introduce herself.
Thank you, Madeline. I'm Lisa Hoyes. I am currently the Assistant Dean for Public Service at NYU Law School. I've been in this role for about 6 years. Prior to that, I was a public interest practitioner. Most of the time was spent as a public defender here in New York City. I was at the Federal Defenders of New York for about 6 years, and before that at Bronx Defenders for about 8 years. I also did some civil legal services in the city, and I spent a year at the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So my first question for all of you is, about is sort of a jumping off point for this conversation. How do racism, sexism, and anti-trans bias toward lawyers shape what happens in the courtroom? And how do you navigate both the challenges and opportunities that can come from representing clients and having a marginalized gender expression? Do you ever find yourself upholding societal norms that you would prefer to help dismantle?
I guess I can start. So this first question is obviously a really big one, which is not a critique. I fully support it. Um, and um, and all of those things, racism, sexism, and anti-trans bias, shape legal practice in more ways than we'll actually be able to cover here. I thought it might be helpful to share a little bit about what my experiences were like in law school. Partly because for me, I started socially transitioning just a handful of months before I came to law school. So I was both getting acculturated to the legal profession and experiencing all the repercussions of people perceiving my gender differently at the same time, um, which was a very interesting and sort of disorienting process. So on the one hand, I was losing cis privilege. So I was suddenly having doctors saying they wouldn't treat me. I was having bouncers saying I couldn't get into bars. I was having, faculty, staff, and students gossiping about my body and my gender and getting deliberately misgendered. I was scared every time I went to the bathroom, all those types of things. And then at the same time, in some situations, I was starting to gain male privilege for the first time because I was starting to be perceived as a man. Um, and in some situations, that's just very tangible, like, I stopped experiencing street-based sexual harassment, which had been sort of a daily reality for me beforehand, and then it just stopped completely. I mean, I did start getting called a faggot sometimes on the street, but let me tell you, that is just not nearly as bad as what I experienced when I was perceived as a woman. Um, and then other stuff, it's a little bit less tangible, but still incredibly strong. And I remember actually very clearly when I was at NYU, um, as a 2L, I was doing an oral argument competition of some sort. And I walked into the room to do my argument, and there were these three older um, white men. And the way that they greeted me was with just such casual warmth and with such an assumption that I was about to do great things. Like just a complete assumption that I was absolutely competent and was going to be brilliant that I had literally never experienced in my life being perceived as a woman. Um, and it was hard to say exactly what it was that they said or did that gave me that impression, but I was absolutely positive that I would not have experienced that if they were perceiving me as a woman or if they found out that I was trans. Um, and that plays out in the courtroom too. So also when I was in law school, um, I did a number of internships in housing court, and I had one supervisor who was a white man who had been practicing for 8 years and had never gone to trial. He always got good settlement offers for his clients. It always made sense to settle. And then later, I had a supervisor who was a South Asian woman, and when she first started practicing, she was only getting terrible settlement offers for her clients because the landlord's lawyers just weren't taking her seriously. She ended up trying 4 cases in her first year as a lawyer. And after that, she established a reputation as somebody who was tough and not afraid to litigate. And she started getting very excellent settlement offers for her clients. Um, I mean, both of those lawyers were doing great work. Um, and while at first it may be that the woman's clients were at somewhat of a disadvantage because of the settlement offers. I think her later clients ended up, if anything, being at an advantage because she had built this really strong reputation and she really genuinely wasn't afraid to go to trial because she really knew how to do it. Um, so I don't know. I mean, all these things play out in all sorts of different ways. And I think all of us in some moments end up upholding norms that we would rather be dismantling. But um, But I don't know, I guess, but those are my starting thoughts.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I have to say my experience with noticing that competence for the first time came to me in law school as well. I kind of always thought my gender isn't in my way. So thank you so much for sharing those experiences. Lisa or Danny, would you like to add on to that?
I think I'm going out of alphabetical order, but I was super moved by what Gabriel just said. So I'm going to start talking. Is that cool, Danny? I guess I wanted to start too by reflecting a little bit on my privilege in navigating these spaces because, you know, I'm assuming I was asked to join this panel because I am a woman of color and I was a trial lawyer for many years. That said, I definitely walked through that world with tons of privilege, being a extremely light-skinned, racially ambiguous, cis, femme, gender conforming, all that stuff. I identify as Black. I don't believe much of the world perceives me as Black. And so it made it a unique experience to try cases with those sort of identities at work. But I should also note that most of my trials were done in the Bronx, where it was an anomaly to have a white juror. My juries were mostly Black and brown people, which is, you know, will certainly affect all of the thoughts that I have tonight. And in federal court, I was in the Eastern District of New York, which was far more diverse than most federal courthouses, I'm sure. But what moved me when Gabriel spoke was that I realized I've never walked into a situation where I felt like the consensus, the expectation was that I would be competent and know what I was doing. And it is so internalized because I feel like I'm just always my authentic self. I do my thing, I am me. But what that is includes fighting against bias and preconceived notions, and that's the baseline of knowing that in some ways these are all hostile environments because of even given all of my privileges, because I am a woman of color and having to claw my way out to combat those biases to do the best I possibly can for my clients. And I think Claire or Abby might have mentioned that one of the sparks for pulling this panel together was a comment that I made in a talk to the Birnbaum Women's Leader Fellows. Someone asked about like, how do you navigate these spaces? And I said, I think it's best to be your authentic self. I think you get the best result for your client. You're the best lawyer you can be if you bring your full self to it. And it's interesting to know that to reflect for myself, like what that really means, because my true self is compounded by, you know, now 40 something years of conforming to societal norms and pressures, right? And so it's hard when I think about, like, you know, how I conduct myself in these spaces to know what is me and what is the learned behavior to conform to these spaces. And I'll just kick it off to Danny, but you know, I'll just note, obviously all of the isms are compounded in a courtroom. Courtrooms are probably some of the most conservative institutions in our society. And there are lots of expectations of how lawyers are supposed to be, who they're supposed to be, and how they're supposed to be. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there and kick it off to Danny, and then we'll revisit this one.
So now I have to respond to both the question, everyone's amazing thoughts that they've already shared, which feels extra stressful, but I'm gonna just try and first reflect on what I heard the two other panelists say and kind of incorporate into what I originally thought I would say in response to this question. But I just think hearing both of you talk makes me realize more how much my perspective on this is about being a young lawyer, and not necessarily having like all of the experience and confidence to really reflect on and be able to parse out what is happening in the courtroom based on my identity versus any of the other many things I'm nervous about anytime I go into a trial or a hearing at this point in my career. And so I really do wish that I have more coherent, have a more coherent understanding of how my identity impacts being in the courtroom. But I think that at this point in my career, the way that I move forward really in these situations is that to borrow at least, is that just be my authentic self and just try and represent my client as much as possible. And not saying that my gender is invisible in that, like, of course, my gender is extremely visible as someone that doesn't identify within the binary, but I just feel that I can't think about that all the time, and that I can't worry about how that impacts a jury or how that impacts a judge, or even my client. I just try and establish credibility through especially with my client. Like, I did have a lot of concerns, like going into practicing, like, oh, well, my clients like view me as credible because of the way that I look. And I think that also being gender nonconforming, it's about the way that I do that. It also makes me look young, younger than I think no matter what, I would look young. But I think that also, that gender is really high, like very correlated. Gender and race, all of this interacts with age in like a very interesting way. And so just trying to establish credibility with my clients by showing them over time that I am a good lawyer and that I have resources to represent them well. And then in the courtroom, I think when in front of judges, I always do. I'm very conscious to always correct judges on the pronouns of my clients, but I am not as diligent on that on my own, because I do feel, I feel tentative to take up more space than is necessary to reflect on. I feel like I don't want any attention paid to my gender when I'm in the courtroom. And that's obviously not really possible, but I think I try and minimize the attention that I direct towards that as little as possible. I think that's what I'll say on the topic for now, but I'm hoping we can retouch on these topics through the next conversations as well.
Absolutely. And that's actually a brilliant segue into our next question, which is about whether it is better for your client to conform to judges and jurors' expectations or trying to present your authentic self. I think our panelists have already begun to touch on that and talk about the moments in which they want to, as Danny said, take up space, and the moments when they are just willing to put themselves out there, and the moments when maybe we want to try to background that. And though we've already started to talk about this, perhaps some of you can give examples of how you've navigated this when it's come to a head in more sort of obvious ways, or where perhaps in your offices or with judges and jurors, it has been a more subtle thing. I know for myself as a former public defender, there have been moments where it was very clearly an issue, where judges made it explicitly an issue, and those were the moments when I felt like I needed to take action to take myself out of that situation for my client. But I know others may have very different feelings. And of course, as a white woman, I also had fewer intersecting identities that I had to deal with there. Is there anyone who would like to, now that I've muddled that question, take that up?
I'll start with an anecdote because I do have a pretty bad one, and I don't know that it ends with a a great takeaway. But when I started, I want to not reveal, besmirch, but when I started one of my jobs, my supervisor essentially told me that I need to pass as Latinx for a particular judge. And I thought that was a joke. And the supervisor said, no, I'm not joking. I'm serious. This judge will like you if you're, he probably said Hispanic. And so that's what you need to do. And I was, it was a big new job and I was super intimidated, and I went to court, and the supervisor introduced me to the judge. And the first question, the judge said, Hoyes. And I just said, Hoyes. And then the judge said, do you speak Spanish? And I said, I do, because I do. And then it became this giant thing with the judge, a guessing game, cat and mouse. Every time I'd have a case with a Spanish speaking client, the judge would ask if I needed the interpreter, and I would say no. And then finally I just sort of erupted one day and said, Your Honor, I do speak Spanish. I'm not a native Spanish speaker. And then the judge hated me, truly hated me, and took it out on me. It was extremely nasty, overtly mean, had a reputation for being mean, and I got the brunt of it after this. And I'm sure took it out on my clients. I'm sure my clients did very poorly in the judge's courtroom. It never occurred to me, though, and it never occurred to my supervisor or anybody, that I shouldn't represent clients in that courtroom. And I don't know. So it's not something that I directly grappled with. It was just a really unfortunate situation. Did not work. Identity did not work to my advantage in this case. Being my authentic self was not going to help. And I do believe that my clients were penalized for that.
Thank you for sharing that. Gabriel or Danny, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, so I come to this from a particular position as a trans lawyer who represents trans people in cases about trans issues. And also as somebody who people typically, if they see me, people typically don't read me as trans when they meet me, which means that I have a choice about whether or not to disclose, which is not a choice everybody has. Also, similarly, I'm Muslim, I'm queer, I'm disabled. People don't see those things when they look at me usually, which again puts me in a position where I can choose whether or not to disclose. I guess so. So in terms of, I'm thinking about Danny's example about, do we correct people about our own pronouns, or just about our clients' pronouns? I always have corrected everybody who I possibly could about my clients' pronouns, unless they had specifically asked me not to, in which case, of course, I don't. Back when I was doing legal services for trans people, so I'm someone who is usually gendered correctly if somebody sees me, but gendered incorrectly if they only hear my voice. So I'm usually perceived as a woman if it's just a phone conversation or something. So over the phone, people misgender me frequently, almost every single time. And so I have to make a choice about whether I'm going to correct them or not. When I was doing civil legal services and I was talking with people's, welfare caseworkers or advocating for them with some prison official or something like that, I chose not to correct anyone about my pronouns ever. For, I think, somewhat similar reasons to what Danny said. And my boss at the time, who was also trans, said, no, you should absolutely correct people. That's part of advocating for trans rights. You shouldn't be misgendered, and neither should anyone else. You're sort of teaching them that they're not allowed to misgender or assume gender based on people's voices. But I still never did. And I didn't do it for two reasons. One, I wasn't convinced that it wouldn't hurt my clients. I mean, my clients were people who were already seen as, weird in some way, and I thought that it could hurt them if they were like, and now the lawyer is weird too. And the issue usually that I was calling about was not anything that should have been about them being trans. It's about they need rent arrears. It's about they should get access to healthcare, those types of things. And I didn't want to muddy the waters. I just wanted to advocate for my clients. And the other thing was is that personally for me, it's more painful. It was more painful for me if I corrected somebody and then they still misgendered me than if I didn't correct them at all. Um, That has shifted, so now that I'm in the impact litigation space, I always correct people if they misgender me on the phone. Um, and partly that's because we're in a different moment, people are somewhat more aware of the concept of pronouns. The other thing is that in impact litigation cases where I am suing people for discriminating against trans people, if anything, it rattles opposing counsel if I correct them about the pronouns they're using for me. I don't think that there is the slightest disadvantage to my clients. And I'm also in a somewhat different place, having lived as long as I have, being mostly perceived consistently with my gender identity. It's not as cutting to me if people continue to misgender me after I correct them. I mean, it still is. It takes a huge toll. It's just not quite as completely and utterly devastating a toll as it used to be. Um, I do also wanna I mean, in court, I have sometimes chosen to come out as trans because I thought it would be a strategic advantage in the moment. I mean, not always, but I have. I was doing an argument about, um, about whether trans people this was a case where cis people sued about trans people being allowed to use the restroom in school. Um, and when I was going through the equal protection standards, I said, and transgender people, there's a long history of discrimination and violence against us, and we are able to contribute to society the same as other people. And I think my saying our, I mean, I did that strategically because I wanted the judge to know that I wanted some check on whatever the judge's stereotypes were about trans people. Like, I don't know whether this judge had ever met a trans person knowingly in person in their lives. And I wanted the judge to know, like, look, I'm a trans person and I'm not so scary. Um, and the judge seemed receptive, and I ended up later in the argument, the other side started making the argument and saying, well, it's not really that we're so worried about the trans kid using the restroom. What we're worried about is some trans adult coming using the restroom. And I actually said, Your Honor, what they're saying that this worst case scenario is that I would, for some reason, go to this school and I would use the men's room in this school. And I am just going to tell you that that is not actually the end of the world. And 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 I feel a little bit gross making that argument because partly I'm capitalizing on the fact that I look stereotypically masculine, and I don't want to actually be making arguments that say you should let us in restrooms because we look like however you think men or women should look. Um, but I did think in that context, in that particular argument, that it was worth doing, and we did win. And I ended up doing something similar in the Supreme Court. I wasn't making the argument, but in Bostock, um, Amy Stevens' case where trans woman was fired for being trans, the justices kept asking question after question after question after restrooms, and I eventually, wrote on a piece of paper, I used the men's restroom in this courthouse, and the sky did not fall, and I passed that to David Cole, who was making the argument, and he said those words to the justices. There are transgender people in this courtroom who use the bathroom, and the sky did not fall. I don't know whether that helped or hurt, but I chose to do it. And it's an uncomfortable position because I volunteered to be sort of treated as a prop in that argument, when in fact I spent, you know, a year and a half of virtually every waking minute working on the legal arguments in the case, right? So it feels weird to be sort of put on display in that way. But I was like, I think it might help. And if it's gonna help, I'm gonna do it. Um, and one last thought, sorry, it's just I also think that sometimes I hear from particularly law faculty and employers an assumption that every judge and every juror has, you know, is that has all of the absolute worst prejudices in the world. And of course, judges and jurors have prejudices, and some of them are really, really bad. But I also think that we're do a disservice to our clients if we assume that every judge and every juror hates anyone who seems in any way non-normative. I don't actually think that's true. I mean, I- we've gotten juries to award major damages in trans cases. We've gotten conservative judges to rule in favor of trans people. There are judges and jurors who may have family members who are trans, who may have experienced some sort of gender discrimination themselves in their lives, who may actually really care about racial justice. Um, and I don't think that it does our clients any good to assume that we have to act the most conservative ways that we possibly ever could in order to get a judge or jury to side with our client. I like to think that the substance of what we say in court matters.
Jen, you want to go?
Yeah. I'll just have a little bit to say to add on to what I said previously, but I just wanted to make really clear that like what I'm saying, at least, like I'm not at all trying to give like any how-to guide. Like the fact that I don't say what my pronouns are, I actually don't even know if that's for the benefit or of my for my clients or for me, that I just don't want to deal with it because it takes up space in my brain to deal with it. Like it's not like this fully thought out thing. And I just think that this this conversation should not at all be viewed as like how you're supposed to be in court, but more an encouragement to do what makes you feel comfortable in court. Because at the end of the day, like we can make like we a lot of people do have prejudices, and there's just really no way to get around that. And whether you change yourself to try and fit in within that or not is really up to you and up to what you feel like in that moment. And that's kind of how I try and act. So like when I'm giving examples, at least, and I think I can speak for Gabriel and Lisa in this too, like it's not telling anyone how to be acting, but more just giving examples of things that we've done in the past. Because I'm close to like have been being in law school, like I know it can feel like very big to have someone that's done a lot of work tell you what they did and then see that as what you're supposed to do. And I just don't think that is at all the way that this should be thought of. So yeah, I just wanted to give not really an example, but just kind of talk a little bit about like my thought process around this. Let me just reread the question really quick. Yeah, so I think particularly around my trans clients, I actually think when I have trans clients, that's where I try and distance myself from my gender a little bit more, because I don't like, because I just have nothing in common, honestly, with the clients that I represent. That like I have so much more privilege than them. It's the fact that I identify as gender nonconforming and my clients are mostly Black trans women who have been abused throughout their life and have just major forms of trauma. Like I just don't want the judge or the jury to see me, an obviously privileged person, at the same way. I want them to understand the the many sorts of discrimination that affect my client far and above being trans, or being what it is to be gender nonconforming for me. And so I think that's actually where I distance myself from my gender a little bit more. And then in my cases in which I represent clients that aren't trans or aren't LGBTQ, I think at those points this is actually just reflecting. This isn't anything that I thought about beforehand. But in those scenarios is where I am more assertive about like, this is my gender and please be respectful of my pronouns, like in a courtroom.
Thank you. Yes, I think this conversation is precisely to talk about all of the ways we are all working through this, because I think it is an ongoing process. And I love hearing everyone's ideas, because when when I talk to clinic students, I have to be honest that I say I do not have the answers. And I think there are times that I've made mistakes or wish I could go back and redo. And then there are times where I feel like I handled things well. So Lisa, it looks like you had something to add here. And I apologize everyone for my cats. There's no doors to close in here.
Apologize.
So I hope you appreciate Cora and Zoe's contributions to this panel.
I just wanted to add, I really, really loved what Gabriel said about sort of thinking the best of people. That really resonated for me. I think that is generally my approach in life. And, you know, I one of the most illuminating experiences about like human beings is jury selection, at least in state court, where you actually get to hear from the people who are going to be your jurors. And it was always like an incredibly, so jury selection is basically an exercise in prejudice and bias, right? That's what everybody's doing, trying to predetermine where people are going to come out on a particular issue based on the tidbits of information that they have, often race, gender, appearance, neighborhood they're from, et cetera. And you know, I did this in the Bronx, and jury selection takes a very long time, and you often learn a lot about people. And I just remember so many times looking at the veneer and saying, "Ooh, I don't want that person. I do want that person. I don't want that person," right? And then when they have an opportunity to come to the back to chambers to explain why they can't be on the jury or whatever, like all of those prejudice blown to bits. and it was amazing. And I would have put the wrong, you know, I could have put the wrong people on my jury because I had my own preconceived notions. And I, you know, again, I practice in these unique, I'm not in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The Bronx is a unique place to practice, but I really feel like the jurors were rooting for the best lawyer. And I've seen, you know, my colleagues, my peers were a variety of races and ethnicities and genders, and people got tremendous results if they were terrific lawyers. And so I do think that the best lawyer is the one who connects with the client, connects with the jury. And, you know, and sometimes if the judge hates you because you are, for whatever reason, the judge hates you, the jury might like you even more because they're rooting for you again in this hostile environment with this judge who might hate you because you're Black or because you're a woman. And so I think if like someone presented me with this dilemma of, you know, Madeline, your example of moving from an urban setting to a rural setting, and the supervisors thinking that it should be, was that your example, that a man should be on the case?
That was a question posed in an NYU professional responsibility course. It was not my example. That one.
Sorry.
That's all right. But it's a real, you know, I remember that question being asked, I think when I was in PR class, should it be a white older man instead of a younger Jewish woman? As if you can tell based on looking at her that she's a Jewish woman anyway, but anyway, go on.
I think that those supervisors just got it wrong because she's the lawyer who knows the case, who's gotten to know the client, who knows the issues, who is going to bring this passion for this case to the courtroom. And in my experience, that has been successful. And again, my experience is limited, and there are probably many jurisdictions where they're not listening. If a certain person gets up, they're shutting down and not listening, but that has not been my experience.
Gabriel, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I agree. I mean, also just to the extent that people, not everybody on this call knows it, you're not allowed to take away significant job responsibilities from somebody based on their gender or religion. So that is illegal. It doesn't matter if you're doing it to please the clients or to please who you assume will be a prejudiced jury pool. That is discrimination, and people shouldn't do it, just in case anybody is wondering. Um, but also, I 1000% agree that people that the best lawyer is going to be the person who knows the case the best, who's able to prepare the best, um, who cares about the case, who knows the law, who knows the facts, and who has the support and supervision to do a good job, right? Either the experience or the support and supervision to do an excellent job. Um, and I think often we're surprised with how juries and judges end up responding to people, even if they're very feminine, even if they're visibly gender nonconforming, even if they're a woman of color, even if they're Jewish, all of those things, right? People have been doing it for a long time. And sometimes people can also use their marginalized identities to an advantage in a variety of different contexts, whether it's connecting with the clients, whether it's me, putting myself on display as a hopefully not too scary trans person, or um, known gender nonconforming people who use their own presentation to elicit admissions in depositions. I mean, I've known people who are feminine who could just do nothing more than sit silently in a room while opposing counsel file in, and they might say things to her that they would not say because they're assuming that she's either not a lawyer or not a very good lawyer, right? So just being feminine and sitting there deliberately and letting people tell you things is a way that it can actually work to your advantage. But I'm not saying that anybody should have to work their identities in any of those ways at all. But I'm just saying that I think I, I think that the assumption that people who are marginalized and who are perceived as marginalized are going to be at a disadvantage is not always true. Also, just people who are marginalized and who have made it through law school and made it to whatever position they're in often actually are more highly skilled than people who have more privilege and didn't have to work for it as hard, just to put that out there.
Though I will also say, I think this to students, which is important, and I'm inserting myself as the moderator, my apologies, but that you also don't have to put up with abuse based on your identity in a courtroom. So the issue that I was referring to, where the judge, it was a room with only bench trials, so it did matter what the judge did, very much so. And I removed myself because I saw, first of all, I was getting berated every day, but also the judge was increasing my client's sentences willy-nilly, once on the record out loud, which made it very easy to appeal, because she did not like that I presented as a feminine woman. And I could no longer put up with basically having to be in terror in court every day. And it is okay to tell your supervisors that. You shouldn't have to do that. Same with if you're getting sexually harassed by a client. I think I was initially told, oh, you need to put up with it, toughen up, thick skin, you're a lawyer, you're a defense lawyer, that's going to happen. That does not need to happen. You do not have to use your wiles to get a client's cooperation or something like that. And so I want to say that this is complicated and it's not clear necessarily what the sort of systemic effects of me leaving that courtroom are, but I just could not put up with it for my own mental health anymore after, 10, 11 months of it. I just couldn't. So, our next question, I think we've sort of answered, so I'm going to jump ahead and ask whether anyone has dealt with clients' concerns about their identities, regardless of which sort of intersectional identity we're talking about, and have they linked that relief or either relief about your identity or a concern about your identity to the decision maker's view of you as a lawyer?
I can start out on that. I had one more thing that I wanted to add to the previous question, and then I'll move on to this part. But I think something interesting that Gabriel said earlier was that he worked with someone that didn't get good offers, and then didn't get good offers maybe based on their identity, and then started going to trial more. And I just, I've also noticed that actually in a different way at working at the Bronx Defenders is that a lot of the female presenting people at my office seems to get really good offers. At least on my team, I've noticed that sort of trend. And I think, I mean, I don't know exactly why. But I think the point of what I'm saying is that if you're someone that gets really good offers, maybe based on your identity, or you're someone that goes to trial and does well there, maybe based on your identity, there's all different ways to use your identity to your advantage and to learn how to be a good lawyer, given the way that you're perceived. And like, I don't get good offers at all. And I've done a lot more trial work than many of my colleagues because I've had to. But I actually don't think that's disadvantaged my clients, because I think we've gotten better things to happen through trial than there was possible in offers. I mean, it's obviously a longer time, and I just really think that there are so many different ways to be a lawyer, and that everyone can use their identity to their advantage when working with clients. And then around the clients' concerns, I was expecting to have client concerns when working with non-LGBTQ clients, and I have literally never. And I've obviously have only been working for 3 years and have interacted with a limited number of clients, but that's just not a concern of mine anymore. I've never had a client ask me how I've never had a non-LGBTQ client ask me how I identify. I've never had anyone express a concern to me about my identity. And I think that if I had that happen, I don't know what I would do. I guess if I had a client have a concern about my identity, I would just be honest about what my identity is, that I don't use they them pronouns with my clients. They almost all just call me Danny. But if they want to call me Miss Green, they can call me Miss Green. Sometimes Mr. Green too. People could call me whatever they want. But yeah, I would just tell them what my identity is, and I would say that it doesn't impact the way that I represent you, and I'll do a good job representing you and try and just build trust with a client, and just be as honest as possible about what my identity is. And I would hope that wouldn't continue to be an issue, but even if it was, I think I would just be like, I am your attorney. I mean, I am your attorney, and that is what it is. And we will have to have a working relationship. I'm sorry if you don't like my identity. You can ignore it if you have to, but that is my identity. I don't know if that's the right answer, but that is, I think, what I would do. And then around LGBTQ clients, I think it's a great benefit. I think I represent my own LGBTQ clients, and then I also serve as an advocate with other attorneys that are representing LGBTQ clients. And I think it's very common to feel like this sigh of relief in a room when you walk in and another person sees that you also don't conform to a gender binary, or they can see that I'm visibly queer. I really do think that makes a huge difference in my relationships with my clients. And many clients then reveal that people can see that they're gender nonconforming, but later reveal that they are trans, that they're housed incorrectly in the wrong unit, that they didn't know if they could say that or not. Having representation in these jobs is so important. And at the end of the day, so few things, at least in criminal defense, go to trial, that where most of your advocacy is not in a courtroom. Most of your advocacy is with your client, getting to know your client, and actually being able to advocate what they're asking for. And they can't ask you they can't ask you for what they need and what they want unless they trust you. And so I just think, I guess I understand why this panel is happening. It just, at the same time, I just think it's so important not to see your identity as a disadvantage, and not to think and get too anxious about how you might be impacted in a courtroom and think that you're going to disadvantage a client, because I just really think that you're not going to. I think that the way that you can build trust with the client if you share identities is just so much stronger and more powerful than any disadvantage that you might face personally in a courtroom.
That was so beautifully said, Danny. I'm so proud of you. Love that. And really, really resonates for me. I certainly, think that my identity is an advantage in connecting with my clients of color, particularly women of color, and that enhances the entire the client attorney relationship and the course of the case. Absolutely. And again, in the Bronx, most of my clients were people of color, and when I went to federal court, that wasn't the case necessarily. I had, for the first time, a lot of white clients, including like a right-wing white, like securities trader type person. And, I think even in those relationships, I was just me, and I maybe couldn't connect on the same level that I could connect with other clients, and didn't have the same depth of relationship, but I just brought myself to it and I didn't get a negative reaction. And maybe again, that's circling back to what we talked about in the beginning, of this feeling of always trying to claw my way to prove my ability and capability, and present a strong front, like, I am your lawyer, deal with it. This is what you got, and we're gonna roll with it. There was one funny incident in the Bronx with a Black woman client of mine who said to me, at some point, I represented her for a very long time, and it was a very involved case. And then at a certain point, she said to me right before trial, "Lisa, I think I need to get a Jewish lawyer." And I was like, "Oh my God, I'm Jewish." She was like, "You know what I mean." And she did not mean this Jamaican Jewish girl. She meant a white man. And it was funny, and we pushed past it and continued a great relationship and got a good result in her case.
This is making me remember things that I hadn't originally thought of when I heard the question. I mean, so for the most part, my clients, some of my clients have expressed relief that I'm also trans, because mostly just because they assume that means I get certain things. And they're not going to have to, spend hours trying to educate me on why hormones matter or something, right? Um, and but that said, I mean, going back to some of Danny's original remarks, when I'm representing, which I used to only represent, and I now still sometimes represent, um, trans women of color who are low income, often incarcerated, homeless, immigrants, like that sort of like shared identity, trans identity only goes so far. I'm a white guy who grew up with money. I've never been incarcerated. I've never been homeless. I'm not an immigrant. So there's a lot of distance there too. And like a lot of work to do to try to bridge that distance. I have had clients who I'm remembering that I had one client. It was interesting. She was a Black trans woman, and she said that she really wanted a woman to represent her, and therefore wanted this other person in the office to represent her. Um, but the thing is, both that other lawyer and I are trans men. Like, our genders are actually identical. It's just that he's less often perceived as a man. And so we had like these long conversations with her trying to explain that our genders were actually the same. And she wasn't going to get any more of a woman if he represented her instead of me, which is just a little bit awkward, but whatever. We moved past it. I have had clients also, um, if any clients have been relieved that I'm, a white guy who comes from the Northeast US, none of them have ever expressed it to me. I don't know that that has ever been true. Um, I I also I have had clients who have sort of gone on rants about um, about groups that I'm a part of that they didn't realize I was a part of. So I've had a client go on a rant against Muslims. I've had a client go on a rant against trans men who are also gay or bisexual, um, which is which in those situations, I was just like, all right, this isn't about me. I'm just gonna try to get them back on topic and move forward. But in retros but I do think that you can do something different in those moments, and in retrospect, I think I might have done something different. If that happened now, I would probably do something different. Um, and, um, and it's sometimes actually easier for people outside the situation. Like, I've also been in situations where my colleagues um, were getting some pushback from clients or were being harassed by clients, and they also were like, all right, but they're the client. I'm just going to focus on what they need. And I was like, actually, this is not okay. Do you want me to say something? Do you want to help practice you saying something? Are you really sure you want to just move forward with it in this way? And I found that helpful when people have offered to do it with me as well. I did draw the line. There was somebody who was seeking services at the place where I worked who had previously sexually assaulted me, and I was like, nope, absolutely not. Not representing them. Somebody else can represent him, but I don't want to hear about him. I don't want to see him. Totally separate from me if you're going to do it. And my colleagues respected that and made it happen.
Thank you. All right, everyone. The CLE code you've all been waiting for is CRM153. That's C as in cat, R as in room, M as in music, 153, the 15th of March. All right. We have taken up a bit of time, so I am just going to throw, where did my Q&A screen go? There it is. One question that we have is for those of you who have a great deal of experience representing transgender clients, what are things that lawyers in those situations should be asking from the start or be aware of in building their client relationships?
Well, there are some publications out there on this, and there are also full CLE trainings on this topic. Um, Generally, you want to accept the person as whatever gender they say they are, use the correct pronouns, don't ask people random invasive questions about their bodies, and do an excellent job as their lawyer. Don't assume that everything is about their being trans, and use whatever legal skills you have to represent them to the utmost of your ability.
Another question in the, or sort of I'm going to ask it as a dual question, two questions from the same person. In your experience, do juror questionnaires ask jurors to identify their sex or gender? And do you feel it's necessary to identify yourself as a particular gender when you meet a client? This questioner asks and says that they have to explain the reason they're in a wheelchair so people believe their brain still works.
I mean, personally, when I introduce myself to new clients, I do usually tell them that I'm a trans man, and that's just because to the extent I'm representing other trans people, if I were in their position, I'd want to know that at least one of my lawyers was also trans. Um, and yeah, I hear there's so many disability-related prejudices out there that we didn't even get in there. I do sometimes also just sort of sprinkle casually into conversation something about my um, psych disabilities, which has sometimes led clients to suddenly tell me a whole lot about their non-apparent disabilities that have sometimes been really relevant and helpful to their case, even if it was only thinking about accommodations for our own communication for the courtroom. So that's what I do. And I don't know about juror questionnaires. I've never had a jury trial.
Most jury selection is done in person without a questionnaire. I did one with a questionnaire and I can't remember if it had gender on it.
The most recent jury trial that I did, it did have gender on it, but I think that it's different in different jurisdictions. And then I really just think that when you meet clients, it just I don't, because my gender, I think, is visible. Like, the fact that I'm gender nonconforming is visible, so I don't feel that I have to announce it. And yeah, I think that especially like, I meet my clients in arraignments usually, and they're in a state of panic. So I think at that point, there's usually very little conversation about me. But I think if it's necessary, if you feel that it's necessary for you to say something about your identity in order to make you feel the most comfortable and be the best lawyer possible, that's completely valid. And that's like, there's definitely space for that to be done.
The last question I'm going to ask, because we're already a little bit over time, is whether your gender expression or your clients has impacted your working relationship with opposing counsel, and if so, how you handled that situation.
Oh, absolutely. In a variety of different ways. I mean, if opposing counsel is being too terrible to me, I am not above asking my co-counsel to handle some of the communication with them. But there are also ways in which, if opposing counsel is being really inappropriate and it's on the record, that can actually be advantageous to the client, like if it's at a deposition or if it's in court. Um, Even judges who aren't generally with us on who might not start out, at least, as with us on the substance of our cases, still sometimes endorse a sense of decorum where at least you're not supposed to say overtly terrible things about opposing counsel or the opposing party. So it sometimes actually leads to a sort of helpful judicial smackdown. And sometimes I think it can also be helpful in a way, like opposing counsel will say things they might not otherwise say, um, which which sometimes can actually be useful in negotiations or in litigation.
Going once, going twice. All right, well, thank you to all of our wonderful panelists. I learned so much from this conversation, and I'm really grateful for your time and your thoughtful representation of your clients. Thank you for the work that you do. And with that, I will hand it over to Abby.
Thank you all so much for being here, to all of our wonderful panelists and to our moderator, and also to our co-sponsors, the Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, and to Outlaw for helping us bring this panel to as many of you as we could tonight. Thank you to our audience for joining us. We hope you'll join our upcoming events. There will be a slide up shortly with our upcoming events. You can also find them on the BWLN website. And please join our mailing list, which we'll put the link in the chat for any future events. So thank you again and have a wonderful evening.